Wonderful stuff, wonderful stuff. So then, Dr. Marwala, if you want to start off by saying a few words.
No, thank you very much. Should I stand or should I sit down?
Whatever you feel.
Thank you very much. Few months ago, I went to an unnamed country. The reason is because I named the country and the ambassador came to have a special visit in my office of that country. So it was 4 of us. It was Bongani, it was Peter Vale, Oscar van Heerden, and me. So we're at the airport. As we enter in this country, you put your passport on some piece of machine, and you have a camera that is looking at you. So as a person who was leading the delegation, I was the first one to go. I did exactly that. It could not recognize me. It denied me access. Then came Peter Vale. Peter Vale's ancestry is actually English. I did the same, put this passport on this machine. The camera looks at him and allows him. Then came Bongani Ngolunga. Please don't try to pronounce, you're going to actually chew your tongue. And then it could not recognize him, it denied him access. Then Oscar van Heerden. Of course, van Heerden is a Dutch name. So you can actually see the ancestry of Oscar. It allowed him access. Of course, this is a machine learning system. It verifies the picture on the passport that it is the same as the picture that it is seeing. So I was wondering, why is this device discriminating against me and Bongani Ngolunga and actually allowing access for Peter Vale and Oscar van Heerden? The reason for that is because the data that was used was collected mainly from Europe, North America, and Asia, not from Empangeni, where Bongani comes from, or Dutuni, where I come from. And why is that the case? The reason for that is because the economic distribution of resources are such that you have more resources at Cambridge than in my village in Dutuni. And this is really what is happening. We are having these devices that have been designed, they have been fed with data, and this data is actually reflecting the economic patterns of our society. And the result of that is that Bongani and I are denied access, Peter and Oscar are given access. And I come from South Africa, so I know what it actually means, It actually means that the behavior of machines is coming to the behavior of people. So what is actually happening is that these devices, even though they are more rational than a human being, they're actually very, very rational. They're consistent. They make decisions that are consistent, but they actually are biased. So how do we design this machine so that they can reflect the future as we desire it, rather than the future, the present as it exists, and all its asymmetries and contradictions, and so on and so forth. That is really my take on artificial intelligence. I'm reminded of a famous British author, Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens has this, the tale of two cities, hope against despair. And I think artificial intelligence is going to give us a lot of hope. It's going to solve many, many problems, very important problems in medical sciences. But it is also going to give us some griefs. It certainly gave me some griefs when I went to that particular country, and I'm not going to reveal it. I was at the Rhodes House, and I revealed it by mistake. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming here tonight to hear us speak and talk, and thank you so much for the invite. So, I've been working for a long time to help computers think about the world more like people and less like machines. And in order to do that, so that they can look at the world more like we do and less like the problems that Tshilidzi encountered. So I first got into this particular area of AI. I run a very large crowdsourced resource, in fact, the first use of crowdsourcing, called ConceptNet at MIT. And ConceptNet can be used for a lot of different things, and it's largely created through crowdsourcing and through reading the web. And we were using it years ago, back when this kind of thing was new, to start looking at restaurant reviews near the university. And you know, if there's one thing that really makes people interested, it's can we have the AI discover where we should go to lunch? But we noticed something really interesting really fast, which was the AI, from using its ideas of the way the world works, was more likely to recommend certain types of ethnic restaurants than others. And so that started us down the path of being able to take a look at bias in natural language processing and how to remove it as best as we can from the systems that we all use and program on every day. So I also work in computational creativity. So my goal is to help computers be able to think and act and understand context in ways that's much more human-like than what we're doing today. There's been a lot of advances in my field. Deep learning and all these things that you've heard about have really changed the way that we think about the world and the way that AI can work. But that's not really going to be enough. If we talk about the sort of goals that we have right now and the limitations of deep learning, we're really going to need something new and something different in order to jump over those hurdles, and I hope we'll explore some of that through the questions today. And we need to do that because in order for AIs to be able to achieve goals like being able to explain their actions and being able to make more unbiased decisions, we're going to need a deeper type of AI than what we're creating. So thank you all so much, and we'll talk as we go through this panel.
So thank you. Thank you very much. Those are great remarks. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm also quite pleased that it's not a debate. I don't have to wear a tuxedo. I don't have to have a perfunctory joke at the beginning at the expense of Cambridge. And I don't have to treat my fellow speakers as adversaries with winners and losers at the end who are voted on. So the issue of bias has come up twice. And it's a very relevant one because, of course, we're just at the outset of the AI era. We're sort of at the Aristotelian moment, if you will. It's sort of we're emerging from a sort of a dark period. Sure, it's been around for 60 years, but what we called AI in 1956 when the term was coined at the famous John McCarthy Dartmouth seminar, and what we used the term AI to mean today is something radically different. Before we tried to create rules, now we try to use math. Okay, and it's doing far better. We can actually achieve it. It's not as brittle as before. And it's so important to identify these biases at the outset because if we don't get it right in terms of the foundation, you can extrapolate and see the mess that's going to be created because when AI fails, it'll fail catastrophically. Okay, but when it works really, really well. So I'm the optimist here in the panel because although I think it's really important that we recognize these biases, not to say that the others aren't optimistic, but I think the biases, although we can see them today as real impediments, we're going to get over them. Not entirely. We'll still always have problems, but we always have problems with biases and statistics. That's almost the first day of class that you learn. But I think largely there will be a huge community that will work on these problems. So we should focus on the benefits of how AI works, not on how there's all of these shortcomings to it, even though it's easier and in our comfort zone to talk about those shortcomings. In fact, it's almost like a malaise of us because if we talk purely about these huge benefits, it looks like we're uncritical of the technology. I don't think that's right. I think there's so much to cheer about the technology that a balanced way of looking at it is to glorify what's so special about it while being mindful of the criticisms. But I want to conclude, and then to start off the panel, conclude my introductory remarks by talking about the two curses of AI. The first one is privacy, and the second one is explainability. why these are the two curses of AI is that in order to get the benefits of AI, we have to overcome these stumbling blocks. In the case of privacy, it's the fact that the technologies, the techniques that really are showing promise, like deep learning, only work when you can use all of the data, and you don't make any presumptions about what data is relevant or not, because the algorithm can actually surface the relevant variables and covariance that matter. The problem? Privacy law, as it's construed today, is very hostile to this approach. I can go into more details in the panel of exactly how and maybe how we need to loosen privacy in order to get the benefits of AI. The second is on explainability. We know these techniques work. They work better than other approaches, traditional statistical approaches in which we have a model that we've actually thought through in advance, because we can measure it against ground truth and we can validate it. However, we don't know why these techniques work. In fact, Catherine mentioned that as well in terms of explainability. And the problem may come is that we can get explainability a bit, but not entirely. And so then what do we do as society? If we know that we can use a high-performance algorithm and give up on explainability, we know we can actually cure, better diagnose someone for a disease, but we don't know why when there will be misdiagnoses. So what do? Do we accept a lower performance algorithm, sort of a non-AI or not full AI, so that we can have explainability, but we know that some people will be mischaracterized, and therefore some people may die who might not otherwise die. They'll have perished because we wanted to be able to explain something. It's going to be a very difficult decision. I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to a great spirited conversation.
So thank you all for those introductions. My question to kick this discussion off is that most artificial intelligence today is based on the parameters largely unchanged since the 1950s, namely deep learning neural networks that use large data sets to create general rules of action, as we just discussed. But all of these neural networks are supervised, i.e. programmed and set up to learn. So do you think we're beginning to reach a saturation point of what this type of artificial intelligence can achieve?
So I think one of the things that's really interesting when we think about this question is what deep learning is. Now, there's a lot of people in the audience who have probably been hearing the buzzword quite a bit and really are wondering what that means. So I think I'm going to start out just by giving a really brief explanation of that. So deep learning is pattern matching. When we're very good at understanding the world, people learn patterns. And if you take that ability to learn patterns and really drive it out to its conclusion, what you get is deep learning. And it's a great tool. It's something we've been working for a long time. If you look at the mathematics behind deep learning and the mathematics behind so many different algorithms, we've been heading in the right direction for a while now, and we're getting closer and closer. But when we think about real intelligence, we're going to need a lot more than pattern matching. And I think one of the things that we've seen is there's been such focus on the amazing short-term gains we can get with deep learning, the low-hanging fruit, that we haven't spent as much time anymore really thinking about how to get to the next level. I think that's something that's really important. My advisor at MIT was Marvin Minsky, and when he looked at these problems, one of the things that he thought about was low-hanging fruit versus high-hanging fruit. And if we want to go back and we want to think about how do we get AI to the next level, how do we make sure we don't run into the roadblocks ahead, we really just need to start looking at high-hanging fruit. And part of that is understanding the limitations. Deep learning requires a lot of data. If we all look back to the wonderful result in StarCraft that we saw in the past week, the amount of money it would take for someone in this audience to buy the compute that it would need to train that system is over $2 million. And if every time we need to solve a problem, we need to spend that kind of money on compute, that's not going to scale. We generalize, we learn, we do take things we learn in one context and apply it to another. And we need to be able to jump to that next level. That's not to say that we're not on the right track here, but I think we need to be focused on that and understanding how to bring that forward.
Okay, maybe if I could just come in here. One of the things that we have not taken too seriously is the fact that these deep learning methods are actually correlation techniques. And we are using correlation techniques in order to make causal inference. And of course, there's a danger to that. If correlation is certainly not causality and causality is not correlation. The second thing, which is what we encountered, we have worked quite a great deal on how do you use deep learning to be able to predict the risk of HIV on an individual for an insurance company, for an example. And what we realize is that the input data is not always complete and is not always perfect. And statisticians have spent a lot of time studying how do you deal with decision making with incomplete information. And because of the enthusiasm of the abundance of data, certainly in North America and maybe some parts of Asia, I think we have forgotten how do we design machines that can still make decisions with incomplete information. And then the third thing is that the algorithm, the imperfection of the algorithms are actually forcing a new paradigm in the design of algorithms. I don't know whether I'm making any sense. We are even forgetting some other types of AI because deep learning is not AI in its entirety. I know many people don't like this, but certainly, fuzzy systems are still certainly some form of hybrid that is going to blend the two systems. Is actually quite important. And the last thing that I want to talk about is the issue of transparency. Transparency, because these things are very difficult to explain what exactly is actually happening. And if we are going to put these systems to make critical decisions in medicine, some are even thinking about putting them in weapons. Who is responsible and who is accountable for the decisions that it actually makes, especially if it is going to make these decisions with a human out of the loop?
All of that, yeah, all of that's very interesting. It's interesting because it sort of cues up my views very neatly. I respect everything that you've said, but I disagree with 3 of the 4 points. Let me talk about each one specifically and in general. So the first one, and I think it's a healthy debate, that's why we're having it, right? This is the union. Correlation, the fact that the outputs are correlations rather than causal inference is actually I don't think a problem whatsoever. It depends on how it's going to be applied. In some instances, you need causality. But causality is really hard to get. In fact, you really need to experiment and have a trial specifically to get the causality, and even then it's highly imperfect. But when you think of the here and now, how we actually apply statistics, traditional plain vanilla statistics in society since the mid-1800s, you could do it earlier, but let's do mid-1800s with Galton, later Fisher and Pearson. Today, it's we're all in a world of correlation, and we've put men on the moon and brought them back based on correlations without really understanding the causality. We take aspirin without understanding how it actually works in the bloodstream, but we know it works when we take it. Okay, but when you actually think of how AI works and the correlations on a deep learning neural network that has many layers and has millions of cross connections, what we're able to do, if you think about the magic of it, is we're able to take in lots of examples of an image, we'll say pathology exams, and then from that, ask the machine, look at it compared to, for example, patient survival rates, and then look at the output and to predict what patient has severe cancer and what patient doesn't. Sounds great. We don't actually have the causality, that's true, but the point is that the machine learning algorithm can spot the telltale signs of cancer better than the human practitioners. In a study, 2012, Daphne Kohler, Andrew Beck, Harvard and Stanford, They did just that, and the machine learning algorithm was able to identify 11 telltale signs that best predict severe cancer. The medical practitioners only knew of 8 of them. 3 of the things were spotted by the algorithm that the humans didn't know and the medical literature didn't know to look for. Okay, because it could spot patterns that humans couldn't see because it was going through the machine learning, it's going through machine vision. Okay, so you didn't need the correlations, or rather you didn't need the causal inference, you can just rely on the correlations and do a better job. Likewise, when it's the case of imperfect data or incomplete data, the law of large numbers, the world of big data suggests actually that's not the most important thing. In fact, if anything, we can infer what the imperfect or the missing data is based on the existing data. That's almost axiomatic in this technique. In the case of transparency, although I completely agree with you that this is an important issue, I think that over time, in the case of who is responsible and who is accountable, we'll answer those questions. It'll be human beings, ultimately. Where I agree with you is that the imperfections of today's system is leading to a new paradigm of the design of the algorithms. I think that's a good thing.
Then I wanted now to just ask and merge 2 questions together before opening up to the floor. So, following on from the points we just discussed, solving the hard problem and creating artificial intelligence that can think and take these decisions for themselves has been the goal of artificial intelligence research since its conception. Do you think we're any closer to creating conscious artificial intelligence? And if we were, would that possible world scare you?
Maybe if I could just take this one. Much of the algorithms that have actually been designed are actually designed to do a specific task. I still have not seen an artificial intelligent algorithm that can be able to predict the weather and will be able to make coffee for me. And at the same time, it is going to be able to remind me to call my mother. And the reason for that is because we are training these models to do specific tasks. Now, the crucial thing is that consciousness is not going to emerge out of a system that is narrow in its prediction. Because what actually differentiates us from machines is that we are conscious. Maybe I shouldn't talk too much about consciousness because we don't really know what it is, you know. But I don't think we are closer to consciousness. And that is why this idea that somehow machines are going to conspire against us, I think is a little bit over-exaggerated. Unless machines are conscious, you can sleep well. You shouldn't be worried about machines. And at the moment, I don't think we are closer to seeing machines that are conscious.
And so I would definitely agree that right now having AI that we use is what someone like Forrester, the analyst firm in the US, would call Pragmatic AI. It's AI that's very good at solving a specific task. I think there's a lot of work that's being done on AI that's good at types of tasks or groups of tasks. But at this point, we're talking about AI that can summarize a document and then can also figure out if that document is positive or negative. It's not AI that can make you coffee and AI that can also predict the weather. So in that place, yes, we're further, but I guess I'm a little bit more of an optimist. I think the tools that we're building now are really amazing tools, and that we'll be able to use them to get incrementally closer to strong AI. But there's a lot between here and now, so I wouldn't worry either. And I think that there's a lot that we have left to do that.
So I hate to dull the panel by agreeing with everyone. So allow me to at least say that AI does predict the weather and AI does remind us to call our mothers. However, I agree with you on consciousness. It's a non-issue. Yeah.
But normally it's not on one system. You will have to design one that will help you call your mother. You'll have another one that will probably even make coffee for you. But human beings are able to do all those things at the same time. And that is really when the structure of what they can be able to do becomes that complicated that there's going to be a hope that consciousness is ultimately going to emerge out of these machines.
Well, I think, just to build on that, I think if the test wouldn't be what it can actually do, of course, because AI is able to do lots of different things, and all it would take is to commingle many algorithms together, and then you'd have the coffee making, reminding your, to call your mother system. But it's going to be, how does it actually have goals in and of itself that it is auto-generated, and it has a sense of self, an awareness of self. I agree with you, we don't actually know what consciousness is. We could debate it for a long time and still not come to a conclusion. But it just doesn't, from what we know about how human beings make a decision where consciousness comes from, whether it partially comes from the brain, it partially comes from the biome, from the gut, from emotion, from hormonal elements of consciousness, because of so much is based on our fears, loves, and hopes, dreams, ambitions, and epigenetics. So if we don't actually know any of these things, the test of machine consciousness is going to be somehow about its self-awareness. And that I just don't see it. I've not actually heard a credible argument. I've heard lots of arguments in favor that there will be machine consciousness and what happens then, but I've never heard a credible one.
And then maybe if I could just add something that is another limitation of AI. One of the things that make humans creative is because we are able to imagine things that do not exist. Imagination is actually what differentiated us from other sapiens that absolutely did not survive. And the reason for that was because they were able to imagine things that does not necessarily exist. You can imagine a blue banana in your mind. And in philosophy, we call that counterfactuals, the ability to construct counterfactuals. What if, what if, what if? And I don't think they're able to do that unless they're driven to do it. And I don't think they're able to do it as well as a human being is able to construct counterfactuals.
I mean, I think that, so to get ahead of what we're going to get from the audience, AI can definitely come up with things that it's never seen before. And it can do that when you give some of these image recognition systems a sentence or an idea that you want it to draw. It can come up with a picture. But it needs to see a lot of pictures before it could do that. And I think that really comes down to sort of something that's in between what you guys are saying that I think is really important to remember, which is AI needs to be able to take things it knows already and generalize them to other things. When all of you leave this building and you leave Oxford, you'll go off and you'll do something else, and you might not apply the things you learned here directly to what you're doing, but it will give you tools that you have, both ways of reasoning, information, metaphor, that you'll be able to use to apply to whatever you do next in a way that helps you be able to learn that faster and more efficiently. And right now, that ability to generalize is something that we're starting to work on, and we're starting to get better at. There's something, not to get too technical, there's something called transfer learning that's really taken off in the past year of AI that is going to be very critical to doing this kind of stuff. But even with transfer learning, there's a lot we need to do to be able to do that. So I'd say there's so much between this and consciousness. I don't know what a test for a conscious AI is. I don't think we know enough to be able to build that test. I think we have to say, how do we know when we're getting closer? And when I talk to other practitioners, we can kind of almost agree on a set of things that would cause us to be closer. Generalization, a bunch of the stuff we talked about, being able to do two things at once without having trained one for the other. And at that point, maybe we should start having discussions about what a test would look like. But I don't think we know enough to know what the test looks like.
So I think now's a good time to open up questions from the audience. So if you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Yeah, we'll come to the first question here.
Thank you. Essentially, two questions. Just first off, you haven't really talked about possible social implications about vast kinds of automation, how is this process going to look like? Are we going to be a species which is suddenly going to only go to art and drawing and stop working, or are the rich people are going to keep all the money and we can't work? And also a second question, if we lower the level of consciousness and talk a bit about understanding, you're probably familiar with the Chinese room thought experiment, and the idea is, for anyone that hasn't heard of it, is that you're in a room and you have a Chinese dictionary, and you're given some, not a dictionary, but you're given inputs and you're given outputs, and to someone that's outside of you, it looks like you know Chinese, but you have no idea what the symbols inside of you mean. Is there a chance that computers can escape this and achieve understanding, not necessarily consciousness? So those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, can I take this one? I think the issue about work, what is the implication of AI to the world of work? There is a concept in artificial intelligence which they call the Moravec's dilemma. It basically says that on an evolutionary scale, the skills that are older are much easier to automate than the skills that are younger. For example, we have only been writing and reading for only 6,000 years, but we have been climbing trees for maybe even before we became human beings. And therefore, it is much difficult to construct a robot that can climb a tree than a robot that will be able to read. So I think the impact is that, this is my view, that the blue-collar jobs are actually the ones that are most at risk than the white-collar jobs are most at risk than blue-collar jobs. So that is the first one. The second one is that when you put people out of work because of automation, then from an economic perspective, the aggregate demand is going to go down. And we know production is driven by demand. So who is going to buy all these things that are going to be made? I think the whole system of our economics actually is at threat. Now, in terms of the Chinese wall, the Chinese wall, that's what Philosopher Cell actually calls it. I think it is actually a much simplistic way of evaluating intelligence. Certainly human beings can be able to show you intelligence even if you are seeing them, which you are not seeing what is happening on the other side. I think it's just a thought experiment. It's a good thought experiment, but certainly I think even if it is a Turing test, it shouldn't be an event. It should be a process where you are interacting with a machine over a longer period of time. Then I think you will be able to find out that it is actually a human being, not a machine.
So I guess I'm probably one of the optimists in the room about the future of work and automation. So to start out a little bit, I'm going to give a little bit of ground statistics. About 5% of jobs that are currently out there right now, due to McKinsey Deloitte study, can be completely automated right now. But about 30% of jobs can be about half automated. So we've been through this cycle a bunch of times before. Every time there's a big new technology or an industrial revolution, we see this happen, and we see new jobs being created. If you think about the jobs that have been created over the past 20 years, most of them are things that didn't exist before that. And I think we need to go back and say, what's going to happen if there's sort of two classes, jobs that are completely eliminated. And for that, I think what happens there is up to us, right? New jobs are going to be created, but they're going to be different skills than the jobs that were destroyed. And so what we need to do is help these people, help workers, help the population as a whole be able to move careers. This is where job retraining is something that we talk about and I think is tremendously important. But on the flip side of that, the other group where part of what they do on a daily basis is automated, what we're going to have to do is learn to work with machines. And as much as Ken talked about the study where doctors were able to really discover new ways of figuring out cancer, a lot of studies have shown that people and computers work better together than either do separately. And I think there's a thing there as well that people work better in groups sometimes than they do separately. And so when you see all these new benchmarks where an AI has beaten a person, if you take a group of people, they'll beat the benchmark of the AI as well, which is something that's interesting. And so we have to learn to work better with machines. And I think that's something that's going to open up tremendous possibilities as long as we do it right.
Yeah, I agree with that. I build on Catherine's points in a couple of ways. The first one is to say that if you think about how AI can interact in the economy, although it does look like on the surface it's going to be destructive to many jobs, I think both blue collar and white collar jobs. So I sort of agree with everyone, although I'd stress blue collar as well. It's also going to lead to incredible amounts of productivity, sort of a real boom of productivity. And we can just take the one example of the pathology exam to see that. The cost of a pathology exam, which today is probably about, I don't know, about $1,000, and goes down to, we'll call it 20p, because it's an algorithm, right? It's just some cycle times in a processor. It's not that we're going to have the same number of pathology exams that we have today. It's just going to be cheaper. We're just going to be running pathology exams all the time on our biochemistries. It'll be our saliva when we brush our teeth at night. It'll be in a stool sample. And maybe we'll learn something new about the progression of disease that we never knew before, and we'll know about problems before they become so serious that we need to sort of cut open to the body to get into it. And so it'll be mystifying in 50 years' time. That today, we always hear these terrible stories of someone being diagnosed and he has 4 months to live, or diagnosed and the tumor is the size of a golf ball in his back. And you always, I think like you, like me, like a non-expert, you have to wonder, like, how did that happen? How did something that was once the size of a grain of sand then become a grain of rice, then finally only when it became the size of a golf ball or a grapefruit that the person presented at a clinic and it was diagnosed? You think something's wrong in society. Well, that's how the system works. But if the cost goes down so much, we'd see a lot more pathology exams. And we've got lots of examples all throughout economic history that when the price falls, and it seems like it's going to be job destructive, we actually see the use of that good, or increase. And just one small example is fabric, right? 200 years ago, very typical for people like us to have, well, people who went to Oxford probably had several items of clothing, but most people would have maybe 2 items of clothing. One for everyday work, the other one for Sunday, right? And today we don't even, and nothing was upholstered, and only rich could have curtains. Now, of course, by the mid-1800s, because of the mechanical looms, fabric was going everywhere and was being applied to everything. We had fabric on the walls of middle-class houses as wallpaper, in effect. So we're going to say the exact same thing, but in terms of how algorithms can interact with society. It will stress jobs, but jobs, as Catherine has pointed out, will change. And I think what we'll see is the centaur, the person who has to work with the algorithm to get the job done.
Let's take another question from the audience. Let's go to the hand. Yeah, the hand.
If we take our objective for AIs to be to create beings that can make entirely objective and rational decisions, how are we going to create such machines if the data set that we feed to them and the data set upon which the development is based already contains inherent biases? Obviously, the latter claim is based on our assumption that due to our socioeconomic constitution, that this already contains inherent biases that we haven't overcome and that we won't overcome in the future. So if we feed an AI with a data set that already contains biases, how can we create artificial intelligence that will ever make entirely objective and rational decisions?
I can give a very practical answer to that. So as I mentioned in my intro, I run probably the largest open knowledge graph for AI. And we've been crowdsourcing for 20 years. We started crowdsourcing. And the thing that when we started discovering that there was bias in our data, we first came up with some tests to measure and understand that bias. And some of these tests are based on tests that Microsoft does, actually tremendous work in this field as well. And once we understood that, we were able to go into the model and remove those biases. So in the end, we ended up with a model that was very much like the model we started with those particular biases removed. And actually, that model performed better. So the answer is that there's computational ways to look at bias in data. There's ways in looking at the training data set to be able to edit after the fact. And so that's very practical. In some ways, I'm very much an optimist about bias in data because I think it's a machine learning problem.
Now, I mean, the issue of rationality is obviously quite a difficult one. And so what happens to a machine is that in order to train them, it's not just the data that is an issue. The optimization process is also an issue. In mathematics, we say that this optimization problem is actually non-convex. Much of it is non-convex, which means that the optimum solution that you get is the best that you can be able to get. And the implication of this, and maybe just before I talk about the implication of this, these are models, and I think a British statistician Box once said all models are actually wrong, simply because they are approximations.
All models are wrong, some are useful.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So they're approximation, and if we agree that the optimization process is not optimal, that all models are wrong but useful, then you can never have a fully rational machine. What you are going to have is bounded rational machines. And of course, this is exactly what Herbert Simon actually said, that rationality is certainly bounded. The data that you use, the variables that you use, you cannot use all the variables that you need to use. You have to use the ones that have the most impact, because otherwise your model will also be too complex and you will have the problem of the curse of dimensionality and balancing that with the complexity of the model. So we have to agree that the machines are not rational. But one thing for sure, and we have done some work on this, is that machines actually seem to be more rational than a human being. So they seem to be more rational than a human being. The behavioral economists have actually shown that human beings are fundamentally irrational machines. The AI machine is slightly better at rationality, but it's certainly not full rationality.
I would agree with that entirely in terms of behavioral psychology, that the human beings are fundamentally irrational, and Kahneman and Tversky have shown that and demonstrated that so beautifully. But I would also disagree slightly with the presumption of the question that all data is biased. Now, all data is, if you will, quote unquote, subjective insofar as a person had to decide this is going to be relevant that I'm going to collect versus something else. But if you look at, when the presumption of your question is that it's biased in the way that human beings can be biased insofar as prejudiced. Not always. And so it doesn't impute AI writ large. So I'll just give you two quick examples. And the first one is jet engine monitoring. We can all agree it would be a good thing to be able to identify if a jet engine is, in terms of predictive maintenance, going to fail or not while it's in the air. We can monitor it, and we can use AI to improve whether it's going to actually perform well or there's a maintenance issue that might crop up. Hard to imagine a bias there, right? And likewise, you can imagine, for example, counting blood cells in a pathology exam. That a human being has chosen one way of looking at the data versus another, but it wouldn't be biased in the way that it presumes that humans would be biased against a subgroup, et cetera.
I mean, I think that when it's not just data that's biased, it can be feature engineering. Yeah. It can be what we choose to select and what we choose to optimize to. And it's not even about places where we think we are being completely unbiased, because what we could be doing is optimizing against a system that had biases pre-built into it beforehand. And so I think it's really important, and perhaps I oversimplified, but I think it's really important that we look at things and we see whether or not the effects that they have are something that we can understand where the bias is. And that's why we want to come back and say, can we computationally look at, from either a feature engineering standpoint or a data issue standpoint, what's causing these biases and pull it out. And I think that's tremendous. You know, I have two hats, right? So in about half the time I'm in the corporate world and about half the time I'm in the academic world. And in the academic world, we talk constantly about this, just like we are here today. And in the corporate world, it's only been within the last 5 or 6 months that I've ever heard anybody ask me about this. And now it's only in financial services and a couple consulting firms. And I think when we talk about this, we can talk about whether or not what we're doing right now and the efforts we're making are good enough, and we can come up with lots of ways to make them better, but we also have to educate people out there that even in the systems that are used every day, there are these kinds of issues. And I think the business world doesn't think about that right now.
Then I think we have time for one final question. So yeah, if you want to go to the hand in the back row.
Hiya. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit, we touched upon it in the introduction, just about the role that law will play in this and how kind of hostility right now to privacy settings, sort of collection of data and use of data, do you think that will inhibit AI kind of developing, kind of getting to that next stage? And if so, how do you think we can get around that?
Shall I start us off? Okay. So, you know, it's so interesting. When we say privacy, it really depends on who's saying it and where they're saying it, right? So, being in Britain in 2019 in Oxford and saying privacy, what we're really talking about and what we're fearing, if you will, is, you know, seeing the same ad follow us all along on the internet for the red jumper that we thought about buying on the 24th of December, and it's still around in March, right? And it's just an annoyance, and it's behavioral targeting. And it could be worse than that, but frankly, we live in the rule of law, and we use that as a backstop for lots of areas in which we are complacent. But if we were to say privacy and we were in the Netherlands in 1941, it would mean something else. And if we were to say privacy and we were in Beijing or we were a Uyghur, it would mean something else again. So let's go to the elephant in the room and the social credit score in China, right, in which there's using facial recognition among other techniques to identify where people are all the time in Western China. That should shake us to the marrow of our bones, because that is completely anti-democratic in an environment where you don't have individual rights and you don't have any sort of backstop in terms of the sanctity of the individual vis-a-vis the state in terms of privacy. It could be a terrible thing. And so if techniques like that were used for law enforcement in Britain, you might be able to say, well, we do operate in the rule of law and there will be constraints on power, but that would be a really thin reed to lean on. And so I think that we should be very cautious and have a stronger debate on whether we would want that technique, because that really is the surveillance state writ large. Okay, let me leave that aside for a moment, having put it out there. When you look at how the GDPR and privacy rules interact today in lots of ways that researchers just want to do basic things that are sort of pretty good for society, it often impedes the use of data for beneficial purposes, whether it's trying to target climate change, if it's personalized data, but most importantly in terms of healthcare. And so there really ought to be an exception, an exemption, a carve-out for people who want to do these sort of clearly socially beneficial. If you're a certified researcher and you want to do a clearly socially beneficial thing with the data, it should be facilitated. People are always talking about it, you should say that. And the problem you get from the privacy regulators is they point out that the law says you have these exemptions. It's built in, it's the law. And they're wrong. Because although the law sort of says that, the law elsewhere has a ton of bricks falling down from the sky, hitting the researcher on the head. So it creates a culture of non-use of data. And even if you could do it, you knock on the door of your general counsel of your company or your hospital or your newspaper, And the person basically says, it's not worth the risk. Or, okay, you can do it. Write me a memo, which is basically the Kafkaian version of it's not going to happen ever in your lifetime. So there's got to be a better way to balance it. And what I would argue is that in the West, in places where we have these safeguards, that we should facilitate more than we have the use of data, but we should be really mindful of the larger stakes of the role of the individual vis-a-vis the asymmetry of power with the state to make sure that the sanctity of the individual and the privacy, if you will, of the individual somehow can be preserved. And why I stress somehow is if you really connect the dots and think about it, frankly, it's really hard to see how we're going to preserve our privacy. If the state, say even in Britain, wants, and the police forces for law enforcement wants to implement this technology, it could be very destructive to the personal privacy of the individual. And I don't have a very good solution, and I think long and hard about this.
I agree with everything Kenneth has said, and I am also concerned. I think put on top of that, you can look at how much information we're giving away in the digital breadcrumbs we leave behind in our everyday lives, right? How many we walk around with our phones on us every day, and it takes only maybe 4 or 5 points of knowing where you are in your day-to-day routine to actually identify you. When we were doing games with a purpose, in the beginning, Dr. Von Ahn at Carnegie Mellon collected some information just about people as well. And then we found out that it only took a handful of words to figure out that, backsolve that demographic information of labeling photographs. Emergent data is a real problem. Emergent private data is a real problem. And as much as we regulate, people will be able to infer things from other digital breadcrumbs that we leave behind. And it becomes very scary.
I think privacy is actually a very important issue. But what worries me is that these companies that are gathering the data, they give you these contracts that you have to just say yes, and then they start collecting data. I think it's an unfair way of collecting data, and we need to actually think about how we're going to manage that. And the second thing is when you have a company that is based in Silicon Valley, starts gathering data in Burundi, for example. The international law is not harmonized, but these companies are actually operating in multiple countries, and the people where they are taking data from actually do not have any say as to what happens to their data. I think that is a problem that needs to actually be sorted out. It can't be sorted out by a single country. We need to find a way in which we can be able to come together to tackle that problem. The other issue that I also want to raise, the social data that Kenneth, you talk about, something that is beneficial to society. If somebody has a piece of data that was collected from the population that probably did not know how much they were giving, and that data is actually beneficial to society, should a company be allowed to keep that data in perpetuity? Or rather, should we make some form of allowance that after 5 years, maybe that data should be put into the public without necessarily, with protecting the owners of the data? If it is data about medical, some form of a medical disease, you put it to the public so that other people can be able to use the data to create technology that will actually be able to solve the problem that data is able to solve. It's almost akin to the concept of nationalization of data. And it happens already. If you invent something, you get a patent, and I think you're allowed to exploit that patent for, 17 years, 20 years, and after that, other people should also have the chance of exploiting that. And I think that framework, we should also start thinking about it, especially for data that is beneficial to society, that it cannot be owned by a company in perpetuity.
Let me just build on that quickly. There is some good news. So there is research that's being done on how we can process data while preserving the privacy. Exactly. And in fact, one of the leaders of a movement doing that is actually in the audience tonight, Andrew Trask, who's getting his PhD here at Oxford. And so it is a way that you can actually interrogate the data, process it for AI, but not actually be able to tap into the underlying data. That's great if it's used, right? But for someone who doesn't want to go through the rigmarole of applying that process, it really just simply does not neutralize the bone-chilling concern that we're going to be having sensors everywhere that are going to be detecting, be able to identify who we are just by dint of who we are, by the phenomes that are coming from our biochemistries. And so just our face is already a barcode with facial recognition, and it's going to get more and more elaborate to be able to spot us, and of course it never forgets, and it can identify us even with partial attachment to our body parts. It's simply that's not going to be the full answer. The full answer has to be law. Well, part of the answer is going to be law, but there's going to have to be other creative ways that we can preserve privacy that we haven't thought of yet, but we better start thinking.
Catherine, do anything to?
Oh, sure. So I think a couple things. I definitely agree with all that. I think 5 years is a long time. I think data gets old within that time period. But I think to be able to do anything like that, it's exactly what Ken said. We're going to have to come up with and use these ways that we're talking about of anonymizing data. And even when we do, as I was saying, there's this real emergent data that you can get about a person. You can get a lot of information from only a tiny bit of data, and you aren't going to be able to understand when you release that data what data will be able to be inferred about that person later on down the line. I mean, we all saw that happen with, so Netflix, everybody knows about the Netflix challenge. The first Netflix challenge happened, and there was recommender systems, and then the second time they actually had to pull the challenge back because people were able to figure out who individuals were from their viewing records, right? And so if we look at data, we're going to see that we're able to pull out a lot of this emergent information.
Well, thank you. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for, but I'd like it if you could join with me in thanking Kenneth, Dr. Havasi, and Dr. Marwala for joining us today.